All right, welcome back to the second video in our evolution module. We've talked about the taxonomy and the naming hierarchy for grouping animals, or not animals, but organisms in general, so living things in the biosphere. Now we're going to talk about how we have really came about and developed the theory of evolution, which allows us to determine relatedness of species to put into those classifications. And so we're really going to start looking at and trying to explain how the diversity of life came about on Earth. And the explanation of the origin of a diversity of life, or really all living things, is what we mean when we say the diversity of life, is generated and accepted by scientists today based off of evolutionary theory. And evolutionary theory was really brought about through the work of Charles Darwin, and his theory and ideas of evolution has a foundation of a lot of previous scientists that came before him, and also the work of Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with this idea of natural selection around the same time as Charles Darwin, um, and had some influence on Darwin publishing his findings a little faster than he wanted to. But Darwin really kind of laid out that foundation, and we're going to talk about when and how that happened in this video. And so the theory of evolution was proposed by Darwin when he published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. This was published in 1859. And so again, there are a lot of ideas that kind of helped serve as the foundation of Darwin's theory of evolution. And early on, there were vast kind of insights or vast hypotheses as to how diversity arose on Earth. So, for example, Greek philosophers such as Aristotle generally held the idea that species are fixed, they don't change through time, and they haven't changed through time, and that they are permanent forms that were created or made exactly how they are today. And that's the way diversity kind of arose. And the Judeo-Christian culture basically reinforced this idea of Aristotle's fixed permanent forms with the interpretation of, say, the teachings from Genesis, which tells a story of how each life form was created individually and it was made in its present day form, and life hasn't really changed or hasn't changed since then. And so because of that teaching, people in the 1600s estimated the age of the Earth to be about 6,000 years old. And the idea really that all living species came into being kind of at one point in time relatively recently and are permanent really dominated the intellectual climate of the Western Hemisphere for a pretty long time. So from, 1600s, 1500s on up until really the time of Darwin. Um, and there was this interesting conundrum, though, that people kind of didn't have the answer for. And so at the same time, you have scholars estimating the age of the Earth to be 6,000 years old, and estimating, saying that species that are here today were made in that form. There's not been any change in organisms in the past, or organisms aren't going to change in the future. They're kind of these permanent beings. Really was difficult to grasp whenever naturalists were finding fossils of organisms that don't exist anymore and that actually lived in the past. So you have naturalists finding fossils of organisms like this. So these snake stone ammonites and ichthyosaur fossils that are not like organisms that we see today. There's certainly shared characteristics, but we don't see ichthyosaurs today. And so naturalists were looking at this and they were kind of perplexed and saying, okay, if all species are kind of made in their permanent form and they don't change, then why do we see these fossils of species that used to be here but aren't here today? And then you have naturalists comparing fossil forms with living species. And these naturalists start to note similarities and differences, which again starts to bring about more questions of is this permanent form really what's happened and has led to the diversity that we see on Earth? And so in the early 1800s, you have a naturalist, John Baptiste de Lamarck. So Lamerick was kind of one of the first ones to think about change in species and thinking about life changing over time. And his idea of evolution was basically this idea of refinement of traits. And this refinement of traits would happen as organisms would use a trait successfully in their environment. And so basically, he was saying that by using a trait or not meant that body parts or other, phenotypic structure, developments, so specific colors or limbs or long necks versus short necks, etc., would develop and then be passed on from parent to offspring. And so, for example, one of these examples was a giraffe. And so he thinks that giraffes started out with short necks, and then they would kind of stretch their necks and use it to reach leaves. And then so their offspring would have longer necks because they would stretch to eat the leaves, and then over time you would end up with these longer neck species that we see today, which are what we refer to as the giraffe species. And so his idea is kind of almost there in what we think of as evolutionary theory today, in that you have these traits that are passed on, but the way that these traits are generated and developed is not exactly correct under Lamerick's idea. And so then we have Darwin um, to come about. And so he was born more than 200 years ago. His birthday is shared by Abraham Lincoln, interestingly enough, but way before, um, um, not way before, his birthday was shared by Abraham Lincoln. And he was really fascinated with nature and science as a young boy. He decided not to go to medical school. One, because he found it horrifying, because we're talking about medicine and the days before you had anesthesia and these more refined techniques. So surgery was a lot more gory, a lot more bloody than what we see today. And he kind of found it to be a little boring at the same time. And so he studied to be a clergyman at Cambridge. And at the age of 22, he went on this voyage that would take him around the globe to various different places. So he would go on this 5-year voyage on a ship known as the HMS Beagle. And the evidence and the data and the observations that he would generate as he traveled around the world during this time would really kind of serve as a foundation and solidify his theory of evolution. All right. And so the journey of the Beagle was a pretty long journey. Um, like I mentioned, it was around 5 years long. And the Beagle was a survey ship that was meant to go out and survey unknown stretches of the South American coast, survey and look at the natural world and kind of do an exploration as they were out, kind of going around the South America, the coast of South America. And they would make periodic stops in specific places as they were traveling. And whenever they would stop, Darwin would go out and he would explore and he would collect specimens and he would collect fossils and he would collect living plants and animals and all different kinds of organisms, and he would bring those back with him. And he was really good at keeping detailed, meticulous observations in journals and notebooks as he was on his voyage. And he would carefully note specific characteristics of plants and animals, and he would pay attention to how they were suited to their environment, and he would pay attention to differences between species in these environments, whether or not they were similar environments or different environments in terms of climate and soils and environmental differences and that sort of thing. And so he really did a good job at paying attention to these similarities and differences as he traveled across the globe. And so here is the path that Darwin and the rest of the Beagle took. So you can see they started out, went to South America, traveled along, went kind of around the Cape Horn, went up on the west side off the coast of the Andes, spent some time in the Galapagos, which is where his much more famous examples come from. So some of his more well-known examples come from his data that he gathered at the Galapagos Islands. Then they went westward to Australia, spent some time in New Zealand, Tasmania, and then went to the Cape of Good Hope, excuse me, Cape of Good Hope, back off the coast of South America, and then back up um, to Great Britain. And so a long journey, many miles that they traveled on the HMS Beagle. And so he went to a large variety of locations that allowed him to see many different environments, many different ecosystems, and to observe many species of animals and plants. And what Darwin basically determined through his observations is that geographic proximity is actually a better predictor of relationships of organisms than similarity of environment. Basically, what we mean here is that if you go to a desert in the United States and you look at the animals, plants, and other organisms that live there, the species that are found in the deserts of North America are going to be more closely related to one another than the species that are found in the deserts of, say, Africa or Australia, even though they're the same climate. And so basically, the geographic proximity, so how close these locations are to one another, really explain relationships and is a better predictor of relationships than your similar desert environments. So this example talks about temperate regions in South America. So temperate regions in South America are more closely resembled in species living in tropical regions than the continents of temperate regions in Europe. And so this example is basically saying, okay, because your temperate regions in South America are closer to the tropical regions of South America, your species in the tropical regions and the temperate regions of South America are actually going to be more closely related to one another than the species in the temperate regions of South America and the temperate regions of Europe. So even though there's temperate regions, doesn't mean they're going to be more closely related to one another than temperate species and tropical species. So geographic distances is actually a really good predictor of relatedness. And also when Darwin looked at fossils in South America, he found examples of species that are different from living ones that were distinctly South American. And so what this is saying is that each, so South America had species that were living there that had specific characteristics. But then they also had species that lived there before and they are now fossils because they are extinct and they had their own specific characteristics. And so Darwin paid a lot of attention to this because he was also really interested in the geographic distribution of organisms. And so whenever he got to the Galapagos Islands, he had all of these remote islands that were separated from one another. And so he could go in and he could look at how species were different from one another in these closely, geographically close locations. And what he saw was really interesting in that most of the animals that inhabited these remote islands were one, found nowhere else in the world, meaning they were endemic, but they also resembled species that lived on the main continent of South America, meaning that they were probably closely related to the species that were found on the main continent of South America, because back in time, those species probably migrated out. So again, geographic proximity is suggesting relatedness. Darwin noticed, though, that there were differences between the island species and the mainland species. So, for example, the iguanas that were found in the Galapagos had flattened tails that were really good for swimming, almost like a paddle tail, right? But this was different from the land-dwelling iguanas on the islands and the mainland, in that their tails weren't flattened. They were round, like you would think of a terrestrial iguana tail, right? Like a lizard, basically. And what was also interesting is that each of the different islands had its own variety of giant tortoises. So the phenotypic variation, the way the tortoises looked, really differed from island to island. And so, for example, this domed shelled tortoise would only be found on a specific island, whereas this saddleback tortoise would only be found on its own island. And so you could go to each island and you would see one specific shape of tortoise shells, and those shapes, as we would have figured out later on after Darwin kind of proposed his theory of evolution, is really driven by selection pressures within the environment. So this idea of natural selection. And Darwin brought up, he was the first to kind of bring up this idea of natural selection. And so while Darwin was generating these observations and this data as he traveled around the world on this voyage, a lot of his ideas actually came from reading research and ideas of previous scientists. So, for example, Darwin was really influenced by a scientist, a geologist, Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell published this book called The Principles of Geology. And in his book, he suggested that the earth and the topography and the form of the earth's landscape really was developed over this long process of millions of years, where this gradual change in geology led to the current form today. And so Darwin, in his own research and observations, like Charles Lyell, really thought that the Earth was much older than 6,000 years. And he really started to question the idea that all of the living organisms that are here on Earth were made only a few thousand years ago, and that it actually was a process that happened over a much, much longer period of time. And so he actually thought, okay, if the earth can change over these long time frames, over through these slow, gradual processes, then why can't species change over this long period of time throughout these small, gradual processes? And so he thought about all of the specimens that he collected and all of the data he analyzed, and he talked about this with other researchers and other colleagues, and he decided that the evidence that he generated and the observations that he gathered was actually better explained by the idea that present day species are actually descendants of ancient ancestors in which they resemble those ancestors in some ways, but they are different from those ancestors in other ways. And over time, those differences gradually accumulated by what Darwin referred to as descent with modification. And this descent with modification is this idea that the ancestors will pass on some traits to their offspring, but some of those traits will also be modified and changed based off of what he referred to as natural selection. And so natural selection is the mechanism by which Darwin proposed allows life to evolve and change over time and not remain the same. So natural selection is the process in which offspring become different from their ancestors. And one thing I should really point out here is that we're not talking about individuals evolving. We're talking about populations evolving, and we'll kind of talk about this in a little bit. That's one thing you really want to keep in mind, and really is a misconception in the public eye, and the public understanding of how evolution works. The process of evolution isn't a process that works on individuals. It's a process that works on entire populations. And so your population evolves, not an individual. And your population evolves through this process of natural selection. And the way natural selection works is that you'll have individuals in a population that will have different characters or I'm sorry, different traits of a character compared to other individuals in a population. So think about humans. Every human is different. We all have different physiological components. We all have different phenotypes, so the way we look. We have different variations of skin tone, variations in our height, variations in eye color. We vary in our behavior. We vary in our physiology and how well our cells can take up oxygen, how well they can do at high altitudes versus low altitudes. And so there's all this variation that exists within humans. This variation can be more favorable under specific environmental conditions compared to other variations, right? And that variation is important because it means that individuals who have the more fit traits, the more fit variants, are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals who have other variants. So an example in humans is that there are populations that live at higher elevations. Those populations have much more hemoglobin or red blood cells in their overall blood content, which means that they're better able to take up oxygen in oxygen deprived environments like your higher altitudes. So individuals that have that trait will survive more often than individuals who aren't able to take up that oxygen. And so they will survive, they will reproduce, and then their offspring will have that trait. And over time, the individuals that don't have that trait will slowly die out and become less and less prominent. That trait will become less, it will be a lower percentage of that population. And the trait where they have more hemoglobin or more red blood cells would become more dominant in that population. That population will evolve to where most of the individuals in that population will be able to pull oxygen out of the atmosphere more efficiently because their red blood cell concentration is higher. And so that is natural selection working on that population. Whereas if that population lives at a lower elevation, it doesn't really have an advantage over somebody who doesn't have higher red blood cells. And actually, the more red blood cells you have, the more viscous your blood is, which means your heart may have to work a little harder. And so it may not be an advantage at lower elevation. And so your populations may not have that higher red blood cell concentration. And so these selection factors on these specific traits lead to modifications in those populations, and those modifications are known as evolutionary adaptations, which means they fit those populations for their specific environment. And so it's also important to note that what is fit for one environment may not be fit for the other. Let's think about coat color on an animal, for example. Let's say you have a mouse, and this mouse species lives on the beach and in the forest. If your population that lives on the beach, it would be better if you have a lighter coat color to blend in with the sand so you don't get predated on as often. If you have a darker coat color, you're not going to be as fit because you can't camouflage as well. So the population on the beach, more individuals will have white coat color compared to inland, where if you have white coat color, you stick out against the forest background, and so you'll be predated on more often. So that white coat color is not fit inland. It's not more fit inland, where it is more fit on the beach. So the environment really determines what's fit, and what's fit for one environment, what's an evolutionary adaptation for one environment may not necessarily be an evolutionary adaptation for another environment. So it's all contextual on what's fit and what's not fit for a population. And so Darwin brought about these ideas, and he thought about descent with modification, he thought about natural selection, and he looked at all of his observations that led to these ideas. And he really kind of spent a long time compiling and putting together this evidence. About 2 decades he spent putting together this evidence. However, there was another researcher, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a British naturalist doing work in Indonesia. And he came up with almost the same idea of natural selection using a completely different ecosystem than Darwin did. So you having two completely different sets of data, you have two scientists coming up with this idea of natural selection, this idea of evolutionary theory at you know the same time, which is crazy that that happened. And what Wallace did is he knew of Darwin, and he kind of knew of him as an influential figure in the scientific community, but he didn't really know about his idea of natural selection. And he sent Darwin a copy of his manuscript, and he asked Darwin to look over it. And this is when Darwin saw, okay, he's got the same idea. I need to go ahead and publish my work that I've been working on for 2 decades, um, and get these findings out, basically, is how that came about. And so Darwin finally published The Origin of Species, where he supported his hypothesis of descent with modification and natural selection with hundreds of pages of evidence that he generated throughout his voyage on the Beagle, and through compelling or compiling this evidence as he did over the next 2 days after he finished that voyage. And so then the hypothesis was set forth in that book, and basically generated predictions that scientists could then go on and verify after he published those predictions. And so as of now, we've got over 150 years of research that has tested Darwin's ideas of evolutionary theory. And there has not been any research, to my knowledge, that goes against or falsifies any of the evolutionary theory that Darwin proposed over that 150 years. And that is what has led to Darwin's concept of evolution by natural selection being developed as an evolutionary theory. And um, this also brings us to a discussion that we need to have about the differences between a theory and a hypothesis, because this is another big misconception that comes up in the area of evolutionary theory and the work of evolution. Okay? And so you typically have people who go against evolution, and they'll make a statement that evolution is just a theory, right? There's no sound evidence. It's all just a theory. It's just an idea, right? And while a person, a researcher, anybody has the right and they can have the opinion to oppose evolution, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Saying that is a theory, and that's why it shouldn't be held up as being a strong idea for how we got diversity of our living organisms is wrong. Because in science, a theory is one of the strongest ideas you can have in the scientific community. Okay? And here's why we say that a theory is one of the strongest ideas you can have in science. Okay, so as I just stated, Darwin's idea of evolution by the means of natural selection has been supported by over 150 years of research and experiments. And to my knowledge, I don't know of any one of those experiments that has falsified Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection. And so what that means is that Darwin's idea, his theory of evolution, has been supported by numerous accounts of observations and experiments. And we've yet to falsify it, right? And so because of that, because of this large body of work, all of this evidence that supports it, we say that evolution is a theory, because a theory is much broader than just a hypothesis. A theory actually leads to new questions and helps to generate new hypotheses and is really supported by a much larger body of evidence. And so, because of that, a theory is actually stronger than a hypothesis. A hypothesis, if you remember from our first couple lectures, is just it's a statement where we are making a guess, or we are making a statement about why we think an observation is happening. So, for example, right, if we see a bee only going to a purple flower and never going to a white flower, we can make the hypothesis that this bee is only going to the purple flower because of a certain scent that it makes compared to the white flower, or because it's in a specific portion of the visible spectrum compared to the white flower that only the bee focuses on, right? And so that's a hypothesis that we can go in and test, right? I haven't done any experimental work on that. I haven't done any research on it. It's an idea that I have that can explain that observation. So that's a hypothesis, and that is very different from a theory, because a theory is something that has underwent a lot of scrutiny, a lot of scientific observation. It's underwent a lot of experimentation, and it has a lot of evidence supporting that idea. Okay, and so that's why whenever people say, "Oh, evolution is only a theory," they're actually wrong in making that statement. And in reality, by them saying evolution is a theory, they're basically saying that evolution is one of the strongest ideas we can have, because it is a theory, because it is supported by over 150 years worth of research. Okay? And so that is a big understanding, and also a big misconception that's held in the public, is the actual difference between a theory and a hypothesis. And it's really important to know, not only if you're going to go work in the scientific field, but also as a citizen, because whenever you analyze, work that comes out, and you're sitting at home and you're watching the news about new discoveries or ideas, or you're voting on politicians that are, each of these politicians has ideas for, certain topics in science, and vice versa, and the statements that they make that are going to propel you to make decisions in your everyday life will go about statements like, it's just a theory, or it's just a hypothesis. And so you really need to know what that actually means so you can make informed decisions, again, not only as a scientist, but as a good citizen, who makes decisions on, putting people into place that is important for making laws based off of the science that we do. So that's kind of why, I wanted to spend quite a bit of time discussing the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. And one thing is too, I should say, is that just because something's a theory doesn't mean it can't change. Who knows? One day we may come out with some research that falsifies the idea of evolution, and then we would have to change and modify that theory of evolution, or it would be thrown out completely. So theories can be modified and they can be thrown out based on new evidence. And that's kind of the really good thing about science, is that, yes, while we have evidence supporting this idea, it always can change based off of new work and new ideas. All right, so that does it for our second video, where we're talking about kind of where the theory of evolution came from, who was instrumental in generating that theory, why we attribute the theory to Darwin, and where Alfred Russel Wallace actually comes into the picture, and also mentioning that the theory of evolution wasn't just a product of Darwin, but it was also a product of people who were influential in and instrumental in helping Darwin generate these ideas for evolution. And so in the next video for this module, we're going to talk about some of the evidence that we have for evolution, and kind of get into a little bit more detail on the topic itself. All right, so that's it. We'll see you in the next video.